I made a game where you play as a ragdoll, fighting enemies with physics-based combat, but you start off really weak, barely able to stand up. As you struggle to take out the enemies, you gain strength. The character is made up of physics joints that kind of work like muscles, which means that as you get stronger, you can run faster, jump higher, lift heavy objects, and take out bigger and bigger enemies. But if you rush ahead before you're strong enough, it's not gonna go so well. The main inspiration for this project is to take a mix of elements from Human Fall Flat as well as Gang Beasts, with my own twists. These games use something called an active ragdoll to control their characters instead of animations. This uses physics to allow them to interact with the environment and with each other with that goofy, floppy movement. But we'll work on that in a second. First, let's start by making a character model inspired by the games mentioned. Luckily, they have pretty simple models, which is great because I don't know how to model. I followed a few tutorials, and after many failed attempts, I ended up with something half decent. So I dragged him into Unity and turned him into a normal ragdoll. Now, to turn him into an active ragdoll, we need to apply forces to him. We'll start by trying to keep him balanced. There are a lot of ways we can go about doing this, but for now we'll take each joint that makes up the ragdoll and set how much force it can apply to rotate to the target pose. Now he's starting to stand up. If we increase the force too much, he gets pretty stiff. I found a sweet spot that'll work for now. Let's try to start taking some steps. I wrote a script that rotates the upper legs and lower legs to create a walk cycle, and when we drop him down, it's not quite what we're looking for. I tweaked the strength of the legs and added animation curves to have better control over the leg movement, which turned out a lot better. I also added logic that checks which foot is in front of the other and makes sure to take the first step with the back foot. Then I added the ability to jump. Now that we can move around, let's add a grabbing system. First, I made the ragdoll reach his left arm when you left click and his right arm when you right click. Then I added a script that leans the body when you look up and down. Next, I had the hands of the ragdoll check if they come in contact with any object. If so, it creates a physics joint connecting them. This works in pretty much the same way that the ragdoll joints are connected, which means it's essentially a part of the ragdoll. The mass and strength of our ragdoll affect the size of objects we can pick up, but once we make the scaling power system, we'll be able to pick up bigger and bigger objects. Now that we can grab things, I want to try to create enemy ragdolls, but I'm getting tired of looking at this prototype environment, so let's make something a little better. I like the idea of floating islands in the clouds, but I want knocking the enemies off the map to be a core part of the gameplay, so I need the islands to be pretty narrow. With this rough layout, let's try blocking out the level. I'm going to start by placing rocks that will serve as the base of the islands. Okay, that's looking decent. Now I want to create terrain on top of the rocks so that I can change the slopes, place grass, trees, etc. Problem is that in Unity you can only make terrain in rectangular shapes. So I can either create a lot of small terrains and group them together, or I can create one big one and cut out the holes. I opted for the hole method. What could possibly go wrong? I started by making a big enough slab that would cover all the rocks, and began sculpting out the terrain to form a smooth surface along the top of the islands. This already turned out to be a lot more difficult than expected. First off, just finding the edges of the rocks was difficult, and when I did get them outlined, trying to smooth out the edges just ruined everything. So I tweaked some of the terrain settings and kept trying. After a lot of trial and error, I finally finished this section, but there's a lot more to go still, and this doesn't even include cutting out the excess terrain. I realized this was a horrible idea, and a sane person would just make the entire island in something like Blender, but it's too late to go back now. So after an embarrassingly long amount of time, I finally have the whole terrain smoothed out, and now we just have to cut out the holes, which didn't take nearly as long as sculpting the terrain, or so I thought. I keep finding these little pieces sticking out of the rocks, and it's driving me insane. I think I finally found them all, so if you see one, please don't comment, I don't even want to know. Now that we finally have terrain added, I quickly painted some textures. I grabbed some nature assets from asset packs I had lying around. I placed grass, shrubbery, and trees. I also included some grabbable rocks in different sizes and masses. To polish it up, I added volumetric clouds from an asset, changed up the lighting, and added post-processing. All around, I think it's looking pretty decent, especially since I've never been good at this whole art thing. Let's add some new life to our islands. I started by making an enemy AI that is essentially a copy of our player Ragdoll. I made him follow around the player and then when he's close enough, attack, which right now is just grabbing. Let's also give both us and the enemies the ability to punch. I made it so that when you press the punch button, you wind up, and when you release the button, you throw the punch with an extra added force that will increase as you get stronger. Now that we can punch, we need to be able to knock enemies out and get knocked out ourselves. I did this by adding a script that monitors the Ragdoll's head. If he's hit with enough force, he'll be knocked out. I accidentally made it to where you can be knocked out again while you're still knocked out, and so the AI just kept pummeling my head in. I made the enemies get bigger and stronger the further along you make it, which at our current strength gets difficult very quickly. I think it's time to make the scaling power system. I started by making a power bar to easily be able to see your current strength. I added a little animation when it increases, which feels pretty nice. To actually make the ragdoll stronger, I wrote a script that scales both the mass and rotational force of each joint in the ragdoll, which you increase by knocking out enemies. You gain more strength the stronger the enemy you take out. I made the starting strength a fraction of what we've been working with, which makes trying to just stand difficult, let alone trying to knock off an enemy without going down yourself. As you progress, you pretty quickly become strong enough to easily deal with the starting enemies. But fighting isn't the only way you'll notice the increase in strength. At 1% strength, we can barely even move these rocks. As we get stronger, we can grab them with ease and even use them as a weapon. But as you get stronger, you can use more than just rocks as weapons. A weak ragdoll can now become a deadly object. Since everything is made with physics, you can get creative with how you fight. One issue I've ran into is when you get pretty strong and are fighting enemies far weaker than you, sometimes they'll spaz out. This is due to the large difference in masses. I haven't found a fix yet, which is unfortunate because throwing them into the stratosphere is a pretty fun time. The hardest enemy I've made so far is significantly bigger and stronger than the first enemies you face. In fact, he has 5 times more mass and 8 times more strength than the starting enemies. But once we're strong enough, it becomes doable. Stumbling through your first few kills to tossing around giants is feeling pretty fun. Comment below what else you think I should add. I also have some other projects I'm working on with these active ragdolls, so subscribe to stay updated.